"This is our night," Fleur Delacroix murmured to Corbin Harwood as she rose from her chair, champagne flute lifted toward the 200 guests filling the great hall of the Fairmont Royal York. Her voice carried. She had practiced it carrying. She was laughing, she was certain. She stood at the center of Corbin's world, his company's 20th anniversary gala, his investors, his board, his most powerful clients, and she was celebrating as though she had already won. She had no idea that the main doors behind her were about to open. She had no idea who had just arrived. And she had absolutely no idea that the toast she was about to deliver, the words she had scripted and rehearsed for weeks, was not a beginning. It was the end. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here at Ivory Secrets, please take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one, and drop a comment below. What city are you watching from tonight? I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get into it. Annette Beauchamp had not slept properly in 5 months. Not since the October evening she found the receipt tucked inside the breast pocket of Corbin's dinner jacket. A jacket she had lifted from the dry cleaning bag herself because their housekeeper Louise had called in sick, and Annette was, despite being married to a man who had just crossed the threshold of $200 million in personal net worth, the kind of woman who handled her own life without apology. The receipt was from a restaurant called Noma Toronto, a tasting menu spot on King Street that ran $400 a person before wine. Annette knew it well. She had suggested it to Corbin 2 years earlier for their anniversary, and he had looked at the menu online and said it was too precious, too performative, the kind of where people paid $600 to feel cultured, without actually being so. The receipt told her he had been there 4 times in the past 2 months. Table for 2, evening reservations, a charge she traced to a company credit card managed through Harwood Properties Operations account, the account that Fleur Delacroix had signing authority over. Annette stood in their bedroom holding that small slip of paper and felt the specific quiet collapse that happens not when a fear becomes real, but when a real thing you have been refusing to name finally names itself. It was not an explosion. It was a door closing somewhere in a part of herself she had kept carefully lit for 12 years. Now, the light went out. The room simply became smaller. She put the receipt back. She refolded the jacket. She walked downstairs to the kitchen overlooking the ravine and sat at the table for exactly 8 minutes. Then she made tea. That was Annette Beauchamp. It had always been Annette Beauchamp. The woman who processed things in the dark, quietly and without performance, who understood from childhood that reacting too fast was the single most dangerous thing a person could do when the stakes were this high. Because Annette did not come from nothing. This was something Corbin Harwood had spent 12 years of marriage slowly and catastrophically forgetting. He had met her at a charity gala in Montreal when she was 31 and he was 35. And Harwood Properties was still a mid-sized firm that people in Toronto's development world described as promising, without being entirely sure it would deliver on that promise. She had been standing near a window in a midnight blue gown, speaking with quiet precision about a zoning policy that had just restructured half of the Plateau Mont Royal. He had crossed the room to find out who she was. He found out her name was Annette Beauchamp. He did not at the time fully understand what that name meant. The Beauchamp family was not a flashy institution. They did not put their name on towers, or appear in lifestyle magazines, or throw the kind of parties that ended up photographed for Toronto life. Their power was the other kind, old, quiet, embedded in the bedrock of Canadian law and finance, with the patience of something that does not need to advertise itself. Their name moved through Bay Street boardrooms the way a current moves through deep water. Invisible from the surface, but shaping everything beneath it. Giles Beauchamp, Annette's father, had served 19 years on the Quebec Court of Appeal before retiring at 67. Before that, he had argued cases before the Supreme Court of Canada 11 times and lost only once. a decision he had analyzed so thoroughly afterward that the legal article he published about it was still assigned in constitutional law courses from Dalhousie to UBC. He was 72 now, silver-haired and lean, a man who spoke at the pace of someone who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. Odile Beauchamp, Annette's mother, had spent 4 decades building one of the most respected arts and humanitarian foundations in the country. Her board included former governors, general, CEOs of Canada's financial institutions, and people whose family names appeared on hospital wings. She had the particular warmth of a woman who makes every room feel safe, and the particular precision of a woman who, when a room requires it, can make it feel very small indeed. And then there was Tristan. Annette's older brother was 46 years old and a senior partner at one of the 3 most powerful corporate litigation firms in the country, a firm whose client list overlapped with Harwood Properties' investor base. More than Corbin had ever taken the time to verify. Tristan had won cases that other lawyers refused because they seemed unwinnable. He had a reputation in legal circles that had quietly crossed from impressive into something approaching mythological. Not because he was aggressive, but because he was patient in a way that frightened people once they understood it. He could hold a position longer than anyone else in the room. He never let you see the moment he decided. Corbin had married into this family, and over 12 years he had committed the particular kind of error that men who build things tend to make. He had confused the foundation with the structure, and then forgotten the foundation existed. In 2016, Harwood Properties had been on the edge. A major mixed-use development in the East End had stalled after a municipal rezoning dispute threatened to collapse the project's financing. Corbin had been weeks from having to personally guarantee additional capital he did not have. It was during that period that he had been introduced, through a connection he later described in interviews as the right meeting at the right time, to 2 members of an advisory committee with significant influence over the re-aim zone timeline. Those 2 members were personal friends of Giles Beauchamp. Giles had made the introduction quietly, through a mutual acquaintance with no public acknowledgement and no formal record. The investments were at arm's length and entirely legitimate. But the outcome, the rezoning cleared, the project saved, the capital secured, was the turning point on which Harwood Properties' subsequent growth had been built. Corbin had told the story differently in the years that followed. The version he told, to journalists, to investors, and to himself, was about vision, timing, and his own hard-won relationships in the development community. The Beauchamp connection had faded in the retelling until it was barely a footnote. He had rewritten it so thoroughly that he seemed to have genuinely forgotten it. Annette had not forgotten. She hired a private investigator in November, not out of rage but out of precision. She needed documents, not suspicions. Within 3 weeks she had photographs, hotel reservation records made through a Harwood corporate account, and a pattern of evening expenses that told a story Corbin had never intended her to read. She sat in the office of her lawyer, a woman named Diane Sato, who had practiced family law for 22 years and handled divorces for some of the most significant estates in Ontario, and reviewed everything without crying. Then she asked 3 questions. What is the current assessed value of his personal holdings? What would a contested settlement expose about the company's founding capital arrangements? And how long do we need to prepare properly? Diane looked at her client with something she would later describe, carefully, as professional admiration. You're not confronting him, Diane said. It wasn't entirely a question. Not yet, said Annette. What are you waiting for? Annette picked up her water glass. The right moment, she said. There's always a right moment. You just have to be willing to be patient enough to find it. That conversation had been 4 months ago. In those 4 months, Annette had done 3 things at once. She had worked with Diane to build the most comprehensive asset disclosure case the lawyer had seen in over a decade. Not just property and equity documentation, But a full accounting of the specific ways Harwood Properties' critical 2016 expansion had been enabled by relationships and introductions that traced directly back to her father. Documented. Legal. Meticulous. She had re-registered her professional practice under her own name. The landscape architecture firm she had quietly set aside when Corbin needed her to appear at his events and represent the social dimension of his growing brand was back. Beauchamp Design Group, with 3 client inquiries already waiting from people her mother had introduced her to at functions. Corbin had been too busy to attend, and she had said nothing to Corbin. She went to dinner with him on the evenings he came home. She attended the functions he expected her at. She smiled at the people who needed smiling at. She behaved in every visible way, like a woman who suspected nothing. If Corbin and Fleur were watching her for a sign that she knew, they saw none. They interpreted her composure as ignorance, her calm as defeat. They had no idea they were watching a woman who had already won. The Harwood Properties' 20th anniversary gala had been on the calendar since July. Annette had RSVP'd for both of them in August because that was what was expected. She had attended 9 of these events in 11 years and understood the social architecture of each one. In March, 3 weeks before the gala, she had called her father. Giles Beauchamp had listened to his daughter for 40 minutes without interrupting once. When she finished, there was a long and specific silence, the kind she had known her entire life, the kind that he was not pausing what to think, but pausing to make sure what he said next carried the weight it deserved. "You've handled this with extraordinary discipline," he said finally. "I haven't done anything yet," said Annette. "That's exactly what I mean," he replied. She told him what she was thinking, the evening, the sequence, the specific moment she had identified as the point at which she needed a different kind of presence in the room. Giles listened, asked 2 questions, said he would speak with Tristan and with Odile. He called back within the hour. "We'll be there," he said, "all 3 of us." "Dad, you don't have to." His voice had the quality she had heard her entire life. Not commanding, exactly. Something older and quieter than commanding. When has this family not shown up for one of its own? She didn't have an answer, because it was true. The Beauchamps showed up. It was perhaps the most fundamental thing about them, and perhaps the thing she had missed most in the years she had spent trying to fit herself inside Corbin Harwood's version of what her life should look like. The evening of the gala, Annette dressed carefully. Not to compete. Not to perform. She chose a gown in deep charcoal, understated, precise, the kind of dress that required nothing from anyone in the room because the woman wearing it already had what she needed. A single piece of jewelry, a small aquamarine pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, hair swept back, makeup clean and minimal. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had decided. In the car on the way downtown, Corbin sat beside her and looked at his phone for most of the drive. Near the hotel, without lifting his gaze, he said, "You look nice." "Thank you," she said. She watched the city move past the window and thought about everything she was not going to do tonight. The anger she was not going to spend, the hurt she was not going to perform for 200 people who would turn it into conversation by midnight. She was saving everything for the right moment. The car pulled up to the Fairmont. A doorman opened her door. Annette stepped out into the cool April night, breathed once, and thought, "This is the last time I will walk into a room as Corbin Harwood's wife." Then she squared her shoulders and walked in. The Great Hall was exactly what it always was at these events. A cathedral of calculated success, of conversations that were really negotiations, of warmth that was really strategy. Annette moved through it with the ease of someone who had attended 100 rooms like this one and had never once been fooled by them. She found her table. She sat. She spoke for several minutes with a woman named Patricia Chen, who ran a major urban planning consultancy Annette had collaborated with twice about a new transit-adjacent development corridor on the waterfront. She accepted water from a passing server. She was present, warm, precisely herself. She was also aware, with every nerve in her body, of exactly where Fleur Delacroix was standing. Fleur had arrived on Corbin's arm, not at a professional distance, not slightly behind him. On his arm open a red gown that announced itself before she did, with the body language of a woman who has decided the private phase of her plan is finished. Annette watched this from across the room. She felt something she had not entirely expected. Not the scalding, blinding kind of fury she might have imagined months earlier, but something colder. The specific, settled clarity of seeing a thing proven true that you have already been living with for a long time. Corbin had made his choice publicly. Very well, she would let him, for now. Fleur approached her table 30 minutes into cocktail hour. She moved with deliberate confidence. Eyes fixed on Annette's face from 20 feet away. Looking. Annette understood immediately, for the flinch. Mrs. Harwood, Fleur said. The smile was constructed with care. It's wonderful to finally meet you properly. Annette looked at her for a moment. Corbin has mentioned so little about you, she said. Said calmly, conversationally, as a statement of simple fact in a tone that somehow made it the most surgical. Things spoken in that room all evening, because it was true, and the gap between how significant Fleur clearly believed herself to be in Corbin's world, and the degree to which Annette had just described her as peripheral was a distance the whole table could feel. Something flickered behind Fleur's eyes. Well, she said, we're acquainted now. Annette tilted her head very slightly. Then she turned back to Patricia and resumed their conversation. Fleur walked away. Patricia watched her go, then looked back at Annette. Interesting, she said quietly. Isn't it? Said Annette, and picked up her water glass. 3 tables away, Corbin had watched the entire exchange. He had watched Fleur cross the room, and as she made her approach, he had felt something he could not name properly. A mixture that included pride and guilt, and a third thing that was beginning, for the first time, to feel like the edges of genuine fear. Because Annette had not reacted the way he expected. She never did. That was the thing he kept forgetting. She never did what he expected. He told himself tonight was going to be fine. He told himself this until 2 hours later, when Fleur stood up. She had a reason, technically. A brief prepared toast to mark the company milestone. Corbin had approved it. They had discussed it together over dinners at restaurants. He was careful not to put on the company card anymore. The toast was not merely a toast. It was an announcement dressed in the language of celebration, worded carefully enough to be deniable in print, but unmistakable in a room. Fleur stepped away from her table. She raised her glass. The room's attention gathered toward her, the way it always does when someone moves with that kind of deliberate certainty. Tonight, she said, her voice steady and carrying, I want to talk about what it means to choose. Something true over something familiar. She paused. To have the courage to reach toward a real future, even when the easier thing would be to stay inside a life that stopped fitting a long time ago. The hall had gone quiet in the way of a room that does not yet fully know what it is witnessing, but senses that something significant is unfolding. Fleur's gaze moved across the room slowly and settled on Annette. To Corbin, she said, and to everything that's beginning. Nobody moved. 200 guests, and not a single person raised a glass in response. Because every eye in that room had shifted to Annette Beauchamp, and Annette Beauchamp stood up. Not with speed, not with any gesture that announced itself. She rose from her chair the way she did everything, with intention and without apology, and for one suspended moment she simply stood there, and then she turned. She turned away from Fleur. She turned away from Corbin. She turned toward the main doors at the far end of the great hall, because the doors were opening, and the people walking through them were about to change everything. There is a particular kind of stillness that falls over a crowd when something genuinely significant enters a space. Not the manufactured quiet of a ceremony, or the awkward silence of a social misstep. Something older. Something the body registers before the mind has finished processing. The way 200 people simultaneously feel, below the level of conscious thought, that the weight of a room has just shifted, That whatever was most important a moment ago is no longer the most important thing. That stillness fell over the great hall of the Fairmont Royal York at 9:15. Fleur was still holding her champagne flute in the air. Her arm had not lowered, her smile had not fully disappeared, but something in her face had snagged on something. A flicker of uncertainty, there and gone, because the crowd had stopped looking at her. Giles Beauchamp walked in first. He was 72 years old and moved like a man who had spent every one of those years making decisions that mattered. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of absolute stillness that comes not from the performance of authority, but from the genuine and unshakable possession of it. He did not scan the room when he entered. He did not look around to assess the situation. He walked in as though he had been expected, because in every room that counted, Giles Beauchamp always had been. Beside him, Odile Beauchamp moved with the particular grace of a woman who understood that how you carry yourself in a room is its own form of language. She was 68 with dark eyes that absorbed everything and gave back nothing she did not choose to give. She had spent 4 decades in rooms full of powerful people, and she had learned something early on that most of them never managed. The person who needs to announce their importance has already lost. And then came Tristan. He was 46 and carried himself like a man who understood that his presence in a room was an instrument. He had the specific and quiet energy of someone who has spent 20 years in courtrooms dismantling the cases of the most expensive legal teams in the country. Not through aggression, but through patience. The kind of patience that is genuinely frightening once you understand it. He looked exactly like that now, composed, alert, saying nothing, noticing everything. The whispers began within seconds. Not loud whispers, the kind that pass through a crowd of well-connected people who have spent their lives learning to communicate without being observed doing so. But Annette could feel them rippling outward from the entrance like rings across still water. And she knew what they were saying because she had heard versions of these whispers her entire life. That's Giles Beauchamp. Is that the whole family? Annette is a Beauchamp. I never realized. Corbin Harwood is married to a Beauchamp? She watched it happen. She watched the comprehension to move through the room like current, watched people recalibrate in real time, watched expressions shift as the social mathematics of the evening rearranged itself around a fact that had always been true and had simply never been made visible before tonight. Patricia Chen turned to her slowly. Annette, she said, barely above a breath. Is that your father? Yes, said Annette. Your maiden name is Beauchamp. It is. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. How long have you been planning this? Annette picked up her water glass. Long enough, she said. Across the room, Corbin had gone still. This required some understanding of who Corbin Harwood was, because Corbin was not a man who went still. He was kinetic. He was motion and momentum and forward energy. A man who had spent his adult life being the most propulsive person in almost every room he entered. Stillness was not something he had much experience with. He was very still right now. He was staring at the entrance with an expression Annette could read across the distance of the room as the expression of a man who has just understood in a single cascading moment that a calculation he made a long time ago, a calculation he had staked everything on, was built on a premise that was simply wrong. He had told himself the story of his own self-made success so many times that the 2016 rezoning, the introductions his father-in-law had made, the dinner that had saved his company, had all faded to the status of luck, of timing, of circumstances he had simply navigated well. He had rewritten them until the Beauchamp connection was barely a footnote he no longer thought about. He was understanding now, watching Giles cross the hall with that unhurried and absolute authority that he had been catastrophically wrong. Fleur's champagne glass had lowered. She was watching the entrance with an expression, trying very hard to maintain its confidence and not entirely succeeding. She knew the name. You couldn't work at Corbin's level without knowing the name. But she had not done that homework deeply enough. She had done extensive research on Annette Harwood, the wife, the quiet woman, who seemed not to notice her own husband's obvious attachment to someone else. She had not done the work of understanding Annette Beauchamp, daughter of a man who had spent 19 years on the Quebec Court of Appeal and whose connections ran through every investment boardroom on Bay Street. That oversight was going to cost her everything. Giles reached the center of the hall and stopped. He did not go directly to Annette's table. He did not make a speech or a scene. He simply stopped, and the weight of his stillness pulled every eye in the room to him without any effort at all. And then he looked, slowly, deliberately, across the hall at Corbin Harwood. The two men looked at each other across that room, and Corbin felt something he had not felt since the earliest days of his company, when the future was genuinely uncertain, and he had not yet learned to perform confidence so fluently. It had begun to feel almost real. He felt small. Tristan, meanwhile, had moved to speak quietly with two men near the far end of the room. Annette recognized them both. James Rutherford and Paul Adeyemi, two members of Harwood's board of directors. She watched Tristan shake hands with each of them, watched the exchange, watched Paul Adeyemi's expression change subtly as Tristan spoke, and she thought, there it is. There's the first piece moving. Odile crossed directly to Annette's table. She moved the way she always moved, unhurried and exact. When she reached her daughter, she did not make a scene. She placed one hand briefly on Annette's shoulder and then sat down beside her, and that gesture said everything it needed to say without a single word. My daughter is not alone. This woman is not standing here unprotected. Whatever you thought you saw tonight, look again. 200 people were watching with the kind of focused, almost hungry attention of people who know they are witnessing something they will be recounting for years. Fleur was watching too, and for the first time since she had walked into this gala on Corbin's arm, with the certainty of a woman whose plan had already succeeded, she felt something cold move through her. She didn't have a name for it yet. She would name it later, in the weeks that followed, when she had time to sit with what this night had taken from her. Right now it sat in her chest like a stone. She looked at Corbin. Corbin was not looking at her. Corbin, she said quietly enough that only he could hear. He didn't respond. She said his name again, slightly sharper. He turned, and the expression on his face, the expression he was failing to control, was one she had never in 18 months of believing herself essential to his life. It was the expression of a man reassessing urgently. The look of a navigator who has just realized the map he has been using is wrong. Who are they? She asked. The Beauchamps, he said. His voice had gone flat in a way she had not heard before. She waited. Giles Beauchamp, he said slowly, made 2 introductions in 2016 that kept this company from going under. I spent the next 8 years pretending I'd gotten there entirely on my own. He paused, and Tristan Beauchamp is currently speaking to 2 members of my board of directors. Fleur looked across the room at Tristan, at Paul Adeyemi's face. What does that mean? She asked. Corbin looked at her directly. It means, he said quietly, that I made a very serious mistake. She assumed he meant a business mistake. She assumed he was talking about money, about the 2016 arrangements, about whatever legal exposure the Beauchamp family's presence might represent. She would not understand, until much later, that the mistake he was referring to was the one he had made across 12 years of marriage. The mistake of looking at the woman beside him and failing to see what she actually was. Giles crossed the hall toward Corbin without urgency, and Corbin walked to meet him, because the alternative, standing on the other side of the room from Giles Beauchamp while 200 people watched, was itself a statement, and it was the wrong one. He extended his hand. Giles, he said, I didn't realize you'd be. No, said Giles simply. He did not take the hand. I imagine you didn't. The refusal was quiet, not a scene, a hand not taken. And in the social language of this particular room, in front of these particular people, it landed harder than anything louder could have. Corbin's hand came back down. I think we should speak privately, Corbin said. I agree, said Giles, but not tonight. My family's legal team will be in contact with yours on Monday. He paused, then added with the specific calm of a man, stating a fact that requires no elaboration. All of them. Corbin stared at him. What does that mean, all of them? Tristan appeared beside his father, and spoke for the first time with the measured diction of a man who understands that every word he says in a professional context becomes a brick in something. Something built or dismantled. It means, Tristan said, that a review of the arrangements surrounding the 20th Harwood Properties capital structure, the documentary record of what introductions were made, by whom, and how those introductions were characterized in subsequent investor communications, will be necessary, and that Diane Sato's office has already received the relevant disclosure package. Corbin stared at him. Diane Sato was Annette's lawyer, and Corbin understood in a single crashing moment that whatever he had imagined had been happening in his marriage for the past 5 months had not been happening the way he imagined. His wife had not been falling apart quietly. His wife had not been too proud or too passive to act. His wife had been building something, carefully, and in complete silence, and with the patience of a woman raised by Giles and Odile Beauchamp, who had absorbed from childhood the understanding that the person who moves first rarely wins. The person who moves right wins. He turned and looked across the hall at Annette. She was sitting beside her mother. They were not watching him with satisfaction or triumph. They were simply present, calm, unhurried, entirely themselves, and the contrast between their composure and the specific tightening in his own chest was more eloquent than anything anyone in that room could have said aloud. Fleur, who had followed at a distance and heard enough, turned and found Odile Beauchamp, standing 3 feet away. She had not heard Odile approach. "You're Fleur Delacroix," Odile said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Fleur, her voice held barely. "I know about you," said Odile, and the way she said it, neutral, measured, entirely, without inflection, made it the most leveling thing spoken in that room all evening, because it confirmed, without specifying, that Fleur had been a studied quantity, that whatever privacy she had imagined herself to possess had been an illusion constructed entirely in her own mind. Fleur's chin rose slightly, the last remnant of the evening's certainty. "You know that I love Corbin," she said. Odile considered this. "I know," she said carefully, "that you made decisions about what you wanted. I understand ambition. I have spent my life around ambitious people." She paused. "But there is a difference between ambition and what you did tonight. You stood in a room full of people, and you tried to diminish my daughter." You raised a glass to her husband in her presence. Her voice did not change pitch, did not waver. "I want you to understand something clearly," she continued. "Not as a threat, simply as a fact. My daughter has never needed anyone to defend her. She is fully capable of managing her own life, but this family does not watch one of its own be publicly humiliated and do nothing." She looked at Fleur with a kind of absolute and unblinking calm that is somehow always worse than anger. "So, whatever victory you believed you were celebrating tonight, I want you to look around this room right now and tell me honestly what you see." Fleur looked. The board members who had been speaking with Tristan were now in a quiet, urgent conversation that had drawn in 2 additional people she recognized as Harwood Properties investors. Several of the most prominent guests in the room, people whose names were on buildings and foundation across the country, were speaking with Giles with the focused attention to people receiving important information and understanding its implications. Patricia Chen had moved from Annette's table and was speaking with 4 other women, all of them significant figures in Toronto's professional and philanthropic world, and whatever she was saying was landing with visible gravity. And Annette was still sitting, still composed, still entirely herself. Fleur understood then, not partially, not with reservations, fully. She had not walked into an ambush. That was too crude a word for what this was. She had walked into a consequence. A natural, organic, inevitable consequence of choices she had made with incomplete information. against a woman she had fundamentally misread, in a world she had not taken the trouble to fully understand. She had looked at Annette Harwood and seen a quiet wife. She had not done the work of understanding that she was looking at Annette Beauchamp. That error was not tactical. It was foundational. And it had been made the first time Fleur looked at a composed woman and decided that composure meant she had already given up. Corbin found Fleur near the exit 40 minutes later. "What's happening with the board?" she asked. "James Rutherford has requested an independent review," he said, formally, "tonight." Fleur was quiet for a moment. "And us?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen across 18 months, of believing herself central to his life. "I made decisions," he said slowly, "that I need to account for, about the company, and about," he stopped, "about everything." "Did you ever actually intend to leave her?" she asked. She asked it without accusation, as a genuine question, because she needed the answer, not for the sake of her feelings, but for the sake of understanding what exactly had happened to her. He was silent for a long moment, and what she saw in his face was not the clear and committed certainty of a man who had made a choice and was prepared to defend it. It was the expression of a man who had told himself a story for 18 months, and was only now, under the specific pressure of this evening, being forced to examine whether he had ever believed it. "I told you I did," he said finally. "That's not what I asked," she said. He said nothing. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. She walked away. Back at her table, Annette had watched all of it, and she felt, sitting beside her mother as the evening reorganized itself around them, something she had not permitted herself in 5 months of holding everything together alone. She felt the specific and bone-deep relief of a person who has been carrying an enormous weight in silence and has just, for the first time, been permitted to set it down. Odile's hand found hers under the table. "How are you?" she asked quietly. Annette looked at her mother. "I think," she said, "that I am starting to be all right." Odile squeezed her hand once. "You were always going to be," she said. "You just had to get through tonight." Annette breathed. Across the room she could see Corbin in urgent conversation with James Rutherford, his posture tight, his usual forward energy absent. She could see Fleur near the door, the red gown somehow looking less like a declaration and more like a target. The evening was not over, but its shape had changed entirely. And the person who had walked into this room as Corbin Harwood's wife was going to walk out as something else. Fleur's resignation from Harwood Properties was submitted through her lawyer the following Tuesday. She did not wait to be asked. She spent the weekend sitting with the weight of what she had done, not performing contrition, but actually sitting with it, which was harder and less comfortable, and more necessary than any performance would have been. She cleaned out her office herself on Wednesday morning, arriving before the floor was active, working methodically through everything she had accumulated in 16 months. When she was finished, she stood in the center of the empty room and felt the hollow, specific weight of a space that is only fully understood after it is no longer yours. She had wanted this. She had worked toward this. She had entered this company, believing she was building a future inside it. The assumptions she had made were not small errors. They were the load-bearing assumptions of an entire plan, and none of them had been correct. She stepped out into the April morning and called her sister. Her sister answered on the second ring, and the sound of her voice produced the first genuine, unguarded emotion Fleur had allowed herself since Friday night. Her voice cracked on the first syllable. "I'm here," her sister said simply. "Tell me." And Fleur stood on the sidewalk in front of a building that no longer had anything to do with her, and told her, all of it, the way it had started, the promises she had held on to. The story she had told herself, described out loud now to her sister's patient and honest silence, that sounded different than it had inside her own head. Less like love, more like ambition wearing the costume of love. "I hurt someone," Fleur said. "Yes," said her sister, no softening. "I looked at her and decided she had already given up," Fleur said. I never once considered that the most composed person in the room might be the one who had already decided exactly what was going to happen next. She paused. How does someone not see that? Her sister was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's what you build on. Not who you were. On Friday, who you decide to be starting now. The settlement negotiations began in May and concluded 7 weeks later. They were conducted through lawyers, with no direct contact between Annette and Corbin, managed with the focused and mutual efficiency of two legal teams who understood their clients, wanted it finished cleanly. The terms reflected with documentary precision the actual history of Harwood Properties, including the contributions made, directly and through family connections, by the Beauchamps during the years the company's foundation was being poured. Annette signed the final documents on a Tuesday afternoon in Diane Sato's office, with Tristan present and her mother on the phone from a board meeting she had briefly stepped away from. When the last signature was witnessed and everything was officially complete, Diane set down her pen. It's done, she said. Annette looked at the stack of documents representing the formal legal conclusion of 12 years. She felt the weight of them. Then she felt it lift. Thank you, she said, to Diane, to Tristan, to her mother's voice on the phone. Dinner on Thursday, her mother said. Your father wants to go over the first quarter client strategy for the new firm. I'll bring the numbers, said Annette. She gathered her things, she shook Diane's hand, and Tristan's, and walked out, into the Tuesday afternoon, into a city that had been moving at its usual indifferent pace this entire time, completely unaware of the private architecture being rebuilt by one woman inside it. She took the stairs. 6 months after the settlement, Beauchamp Design Group was awarded the contract to lead the landscape design for a 7-acre waterfront park project in Hamilton. A commission introduced through a member of her mother's foundation board at an event Corbin had been too busy to attend. On the morning the announcement went public, Annette's phone lit up with messages. She replied to none of them immediately. She made coffee first. She stood at the window of her studio. Her studio, chosen by her, furnished slowly and deliberately, with things she actually liked rather than things that fit the aesthetic of someone else's life, and she watched the city below. Then she sat down and got to work. Because that was who she was. That had always been who she was. Annette Beauchamp. The woman who did not confuse a beginning with an ending, or a loss with a defeat, or a woman's silence with anything other than what it had always been. The particular and deliberate quiet of someone who has already decided what happens next, and is simply waiting for the right moment to prove it. She had been waiting for a long time. Now she was done waiting. Now she built.